Throughout this video series, we've been investigating what the Bible says about women's roles in the church. Did the Apostle Paul ban women from speaking in church gatherings or from teaching and leading men? Are some church roles reserved for men only? What are God's instructions to the church today about these matters? There are 4 Bible passages that specifically address the role of women in church leadership. In previous videos, we investigated the first 2 passages in this list, and we discovered strong reasons to doubt that Paul intended these passages to universally restrict women from positions of speaking or teaching. In this video, we will investigate both the remaining passages in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, as their content is sufficiently similar for this study. Now let's begin our analysis. What do these passages imply about women in church leadership? The first, perhaps glaringly obvious observation is the many male pronouns scattered all throughout these passages. With so many he's and hims, how could Paul's instructions about church leadership possibly include women? Naturally, we might conclude that the only verse in these passages that applies to women is 1 Timothy 3:11. I certainly thought this. When I started my study of these passages, I was pulled into debates over whether these women in verse 11 were women deacons, deaconesses, women leaders of a different sort, wives of overseers and deacons, or wives of deacons. I constantly shifted through the possibilities in my mind. And then, one day, I decided to take a look at these passages in a Greek interlinear Bible. I was rather shocked by what I found. These passages that appear male-centric in English look very different in the Greek. The male pronouns simply aren't there. There is not one female excluding pronoun to be found. This discovery gave me some perspective on Paul's choice of words at the beginning of these passages. Notice that Paul starts both of these passages with the pronoun whoever. In the Titus passage, the NIV substitutes the word whoever with the word elder, which is in line with the spirit of what Paul is saying. But for our purposes, I'll put the word whoever back in so you can see where it comes up in the Greek. By starting with whoever, Paul tells Titus and Timothy that anybody can be considered for a leadership role. Paul could have used the Greek word for man here, but he chose not to. But wait, if Paul really wrote his qualifications for whoever, how could there be so much controversy about whether his qualifications exclude women? Aren't women part of whoever? One source of the controversy is a specific attribute Paul lists: faithful to his wife. In the Greek, this phrase literally translates as one-woman man. To be a one-woman man, one must be a man. We might think, then, that Paul intends only men to take church leadership roles, and that whoever implicitly includes only men. This line of logic weighed upon me for a long time. It seemed so convincing on one level, but it seemed to come into tension with New Testament characters like Phoebe and Priscilla. I wasn't content to settle on a solution that only partially fit the biblical account. I wanted to understand what Paul was saying. As I sought God on how to understand these passages, I had a series of mini epiphanies that gave me eyes to see the missing pieces that were there all along. There is one major key for unlocking these passages, and that is to remember Paul's audience. The implications can be unpacked from there. Let's see how this works. Return to the phrase one-woman man. Notice that one-woman man is just one of the qualifications Paul gives. Another qualification he gives is that the overseers and deacons must manage their families well and have obedient children. So far, it seems like Paul is limiting the scope of eligible church leaders to married men with at least 2 children, right? Here is where our key comes in. Do you remember the audience of Paul's letters? Titus and Timothy, both single men. Paul himself was a single man. As an apostle, Paul was acting as an overseer of overseers. And earlier in these letters, Paul charges Timothy and Titus with the responsibility of overseeing the churches at Ephesus and Crete. Thus, we have at least 3 single men serving as church overseers. These observations lead us to question our line of reasoning. Paul cannot be saying that church leaders must be married men with children, because Paul, Timothy, and Titus were all church leaders who had no wives or children. Why, then, does Paul say a church leader should be a one-woman man? The answer is simple. Paul's list of leadership qualifications is not a list of minimum requirements, as in, the applicant must be a man who is married with obedient children, but is instead a list of godly character traits Paul expects his leaders to have. If the applicant is a married man, he must not be a polygamist. If the applicant has children, they must be obedient. This understanding has the advantage of explaining how Paul could have appointed Timothy and Titus as church leaders without contradicting himself. Now, given this context, let's consider again what Paul is saying about women in 1 Timothy 3:11. Look again at the text in 1 Timothy 3. Notice that Paul first points out traits of overseers that all reveal godly character. Then he says, in the same way, deacons are to have certain traits that also reveal godly character. The phrase, in the same way, connects Paul's statements about deacons to his previous statements about overseers. And then again, Paul says, in the same way, the women should have certain traits that reveal godly character. In other words, if the women are to be overseers or deacons, they are to have godly character, no exceptions. The fact that Paul singles out some traits specifically targeted toward women reveals to me that Paul was expecting women to aspire to be church leaders. This expectation is not surprising, given Paul's recognition of female leaders like Phoebe. Some people worry about the placement of Paul's comments about women. Why did he put the sentences in the middle of his comments about deacons? Did Paul actually mean to create a distinction between the men's leadership roles and the women's? For example, what if Paul were describing qualifications for a distinct role of deaconess, where it was understood that these women leaders would only serve other women? Although this suggestion appears in many scholarly sources, including your NIV footnotes, it doesn't fit all the data. Paul could have used the Greek word for deaconess here, but he did not. We also have the example of Phoebe, who was a woman church leader, whom Paul acknowledges as having ministered to him, a man. For these reasons, I do not think we should treat verse 11 as a designation of a separate church office for women who serve only women. Some scholars have proposed that verse 11 is about the wives of church leaders. Could this be the case? Certainly, it would make sense that if a man wanted to be a church leader, it would be rather difficult for him to do so if he were married to a malicious, ill-tempered wife. Perhaps Paul is just clarifying this point. Instead of objecting to this interpretation, I want to offer 3 points to consider. One is a point about language. Some Greek scholars have pointed out that if Paul were talking about the wives of aspiring church leaders, Paul probably would have included a possessive pronoun to say their wives, as he does in other passages about husbands and wives, like in Ephesians 5. Another is a point about history. Biblical historians have pointed out that there is a nearly universal consensus among ancient interpreters of this text that Paul is referring to women leaders in verse 11. I've included some citations providing evidence of this claim in the description. Lastly, and this is my own point, whether Paul is referring to wives or women leaders, it doesn't really make much of a difference as long as we remember the context. Paul's instructions on church leadership start with an open invitation to whoever, and Paul acknowledges both men and women church leaders throughout his letters. Thus, even if Paul were commenting specifically on wives, this would in no way imply that Paul was saying women could not be church leaders as well. In the end, all these avenues lead to the same result. Paul's instructions in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 do not restrict women from leading in the church any more than they restrict men. What is exceptionally clear is that Paul wanted all church leaders to have a robust, mature, godly character. For anyone aspiring to be a church leader, that is very convicting. Church leadership is not about status and privileges. It is about service and responsibility. Many are called by God, but few answer the call so that they can be chosen. What if God has been calling women to serve the church as leaders, but we have been telling them that they could never be chosen because they are women? This would certainly be a tragedy. It causes me to ponder. What if the desire to lead really is noble, as Paul says? And what if the desire to lead emerges as a result of God's calling? Then we should never brush away anyone who expresses such a desire. Instead, we should encourage them to grow in godliness and maturity, as Paul directs, so that all who desire to lead can do so, both men and women, in the same way. Hopefully, this video has helped you see with clarity that 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 do not exclude women from church leadership roles. Instead, Paul starts both of these passages by clarifying that whoever meets the qualifications of godliness and maturity he gives may be considered to serve the church in whichever ways are needed. That concludes our Gateway series into the topic of women in leadership. Thank you for joining me in this study. If you are like me, the questions do not stop here. Continue the journey of exploration with me by clicking on one of these videos.